Hello, friends. My name is Andrew Flax, and I'm a board member of the Society of Ethnobiology. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here to our Spring Distinguished Speaker Series for the Society of Ethnobiologies, which will be done by Natalie Mueller on the topic of domestication as the evolution of interspecies cooperative care. Dr. Mueller is an assistant professor of anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis with research specialties in domestication, agrobiodiversity, historical and evolutionary ecology, and experimental archaeology. She's got field experience in Central Asia, North America, and Eastern Africa, and her research has been funded by groups including the NSF, the Haus der Kulturen in der Welt, and the Max Planck Institute in Germany, the National Museum of Natural History Program for Science, and the Winter-Gren Foundation, amongst others. Near and dear to our organization, she's the winner of the Patty Jo Watson Award for Best Article or Book Chapter. She's also an outstanding teacher, as recognized by the Washington University Graduate Professional Student Council, and most recently is the Chrysalis Prize winner for 2026 for exceptional early career research from the Cromwell Harbor Foundation. Her work on domestication and ethnobiology has been published in all kinds of exciting places like PLOS One, Proceedings for the Royal Society B, Evolutionary Anthropology, American Antiquity, Nature Plants, and of course, the Journal of Ethnobiology. And we're very excited to have her here as part of this series. Just as a reminder, if you want to get more ethnobiology into your life, you can join us May 20th to the 23rd at the University of the South in Sewanee for the annual conference. Registration is still ongoing there for the conference in Tennessee. We've got great publications that you can read and submit to the Journal of Ethnobiology Ledgers, Contributions in Ethnobiology book series, and our free open access journal, Ethnobiology Letters. And if you are not able to join us in Tennessee this year, we've also got another conference coming up. You can already mark it on your calendars next year in Boston. Folks, without further ado, I'm very excited for this talk on domestication as interspecies cooperative care. I can say with great experience that Dr. Mueller is a multi-species aficionado, if ever there was one, having kept alive many dogs, humans, and various plants, and contributed greatly to our understanding of how all these species interact and work together. Take it away, Dr. Mueller.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew, for inviting me to speak. It's nice to see a bunch of familiar names on the Zoom. I'm not going to be able to make it to the conference this year, so it's nice to see. It'll be nice to connect with some of you, at least virtually. So I'm really delighted to, again, virtually address you all as part of the Society of Ethnobiology's Distinguished Speaker Series. And I'm going to be presenting a brief version of a paper that I published with a friend of mine back in 2024, just because I think it's something that the members of the society would be particularly interested in. And in this paper, we basically proposed a new definition of domestication that we think makes important connections between observations that have been made about human evolution and observations that have been made about the evolution of domesticated animals and plants. And so it seems like very well suited for ethnobiology, as we are concerned with both humans and the species that we interact with. So if you're interested in kind of like the longer version or like more details and examples, then I encourage you to check out this paper. I didn't pay for it to be open source because it was like an exorbitant amount of money. So if you have trouble accessing it, just shoot me an email and I'll send it to you. Okay, but before I get into that, just for those of you who don't know me, I want to back up just for a second and introduce myself so you kind of know where I'm coming from and what I normally work on. I study plant domestication. I'm a paleoethnobotanist. And I've mainly worked on understanding the native crops of Eastern North America. So this slide shows what those crops are and when they were either domesticated or entered the crop system for, in the case of plants like maize, beans, and Mexican squashes like pumpkins. So you may notice right off the bat that some of these plants are not particularly familiar. And that's true whether you're an agriculture nerd like me or not. And the reason is because they're no longer cultivated. So these five species are what I previously mostly referred to as the lost crops of Eastern North America. Lately, I've begun referring to them as sleeping. And that's to acknowledge the fact that there are a lot of movements to revive indigenous crops and practices. And it's certainly not impossible that the cultivation of these plants will be reawakened as part of these movements. I certainly hope that it will be. So these sleeping crops are a taxonomically diverse group of annual plants. These were domesticated by indigenous people thousands of years ago, but fell out of cultivation sometime around the time of European colonization. So we don't have a lot of firsthand information about how they were cultivated or what the domesticated plants looked like. One of the approaches that I use to study domestication is pretty standard for archaeobotanists who study domestication. So I use quantitative analysis of the morphology of seeds to track changes linked to domestication in the archaeological record. And I compare those ancient seeds to modern ones. So without getting into the details of this case study, this is kind of tracking changes in two phenotypes, size, and a phenotype that has to do with how easily you can get a seed to germinate from the earliest times that this plant was cultivated until the latest time that it was cultivated in comparison to a large modern sample. So that's a pretty standard method. But something that's a little bit more unusual about my work is that I also take an experimental approach to studying these plants. And the reason why I've had to do that from the very beginning is because no one grows them today. So I can't ask farmers about them. I can't study how they respond to cultivation in a contemporary context. So I've taken this experimental approach. This is pictures of, some of the different experiments that I've run, a time-lapse video of me and my students weeding around this time of year, one of my larger experiments, just to give you some insight into how much effort is involved in these experiments, since this presentation is about care. It takes a lot of care to grow plants and to be a farmer or a serious gardener. And so the second approach of growing these plants experimentally unexpectedly led me to an understanding of the fact that these weedy annual plants that people have domesticated over and over again throughout history are really highly plastic, developmentally plastic, which means that they're responsive to the growth environment. In this case, humans are changing the growth environment by providing care, right? By doing things like weeding and watering and manuring. And you, as a cultivator, can see the changes in these plants and their response to your care really easily when you're engaging this kind of careful behavior. So, while it might not be as obvious as something that an animal might do in response to a human, like biting you or curling up next to you at night, it is actually fairly obvious and fairly easy to measure the differences in these plants as you care for them. So, plants are able to modify their growth and their reproductive organs in response to environments that humans create. And these changes can be kind of thought of as friendly. For example, when they produce seeds that have less robust defenses, that are easier to process, easier to digest, but also easier to grow, right? When you plant them, they germinate. So the figure on the left is from one of my papers that's showing basically a change in the amount of non-dormant seeds that are produced in an experimental setting where we greatly reduce the density of plants, right? We weed and we thin. And the other figure is showing yield, the yields that we were able to achieve from wild plants when we cultivated them in a garden. And I compared them to the most recent average yields that were available at the time, which were from 2017. And what was really like astounding to me about this particular study was that, this was on a very small scale. So it, certainly might be different if you were cultivating acres and acres of these things. But were able to achieve yields that were basically the same from wild plants as from their most closely related domesticated relative. And that was just against everything that I'd ever thought about domestication up until then, right? Like that our care could be more important than thousands of years of evolution in terms of determining yield. So, these investigations that I've done into the role of developmental plasticity in domestication have formed the core of my research for many years. So, for example, a few years ago, I published this paper arguing that similar to animals, plants were tamed before they were domesticated, and that a species' capacity to be tamed may have determined whether or not people continued to interact with it, also similar to animals. And I'm not going to talk too much about this research in this talk, but it is related to the argument that I'm going to be reviewing today. And so I wanted to just introduce some of this work at the beginning of the talk so you know where I'm coming from. So that question of sort of like why were certain plants chosen and not others has been taking up a lot of my attention for a really long time. Like thinking about, oh, maybe they were more, responded to human care in a particular way, and that's why people chose to interact with these plants and not other plants. And it was taking up so much of my attention that I never really thought about the opposite or the converse, I should say, question, which is what is it about humans that makes them so good at domestication? Why have humans domesticated so many species? Why have we made domesticated plants and animals the foundation of almost all contemporary human economies? And what is it about humans that makes them so good at domestication? And those are the questions that I'm going to be exploring today. So, before I get into what I think the answer is, I have to introduce this idea from the human evolution literature of human self-domestication. When I first heard this term, I thought it was kind of like nonsensical because, from my perspective as someone who studies domestication, it's a relationship, right, between humans and another species, or at least between two species, or more than two species. And so the idea that you could domesticate yourself didn't really make a lot of sense to me. But I did a lot of reading about it just to see what people were talking about. And what scholars of human evolution have noticed is a sort of combination of behavioral and phenotypic similarities between people and domesticated mammals when you compare them to their non-domesticated ancestors. Okay. And so some of these are actually visible in bones. And so those are things like a reduction in overall body size and changes to the face and the head and teeth, a reduction in sexual dimorphism, etc. Others are not visible in bones. And so for most domesticated species and for humans, these are just hypothesized because we would have to actually be able to observe the living wild progenitor in order to see if these things are true or not. And that's especially true of tameness, which is behavioral. Okay. So we're inferring that the domesticated descendants are more tame on the basis of archaeological evidence and on the basis of how these phenotypes sort of correlate with behavior in existing animals. So those who have written about tameness have been really heavily influenced by the fox farm experiment, which is this really famous domestication experiment in which foxes were rapidly domesticated by selecting on the basis of their reaction to human handlers. So either aggressive or not aggressive. And so that's one way to define tameness as a loss of reactive aggression, a loss of aggression towards a stranger or towards a novel stimuli. But another side of the same coin is that tameness is an increase in social tolerance and cooperation, particularly with unfamiliar individuals and stimuli. So, either way, if we consider humans to be in some way similar to domesticated animals, then the question that these scholars have asked is what could have exerted selective pressure for tameness in human evolution? So, we know what kinds of things could have exerted this selective pressure during the domestication of animals. But what could have sort of acted in the same way during human evolution is a question that scholars of human self-domestication have asked. So at this point, you might be thinking like of the several wars that are raging around the world and feeling kind of skeptical that humans should be characterized as particularly tolerant and social species. But compared to our closest relatives, we really are much more willing to tolerate the nearness of strangers or even to approach and cooperate with them. So if you live in a city or even a really like medium to large sized town, just consider the sheer magnitude of interactions between strangers that happen peacefully on a daily basis as a sort of like philosophical counterweight to the few violent crimes that you may read about in the news that day. Or, on a sort of global scale, we can think about things like instances in which humans engage in warfare. But on the other hand, we're a species that organizes ourselves into like enormous social units for a animal that's so highly intelligent, right? So the only other animals that live in societies on the same scale as humans are things like ants and bees that have this like completely different form of intelligence and way of organizing their cooperation. So, the evolutionary theorist Sarah Hrdy has attempted to explain how the social intelligence and sort of lack of aggression of humanity evolved in her book, Mothers and Others. And her explanation is called the cooperative breeding hypothesis of human evolution. So this is an entire book, and I'm going to try to explain this hypothesis in like 5 minutes. So if you're curious to know more about this, I highly recommend this book. It's old at this point. It's like almost 15 years old. It's definitely worth reading it if you've never come across it before. So I want to just start by quickly defining what cooperative breeding is, because it's not really a term that's used outside of like zoology. It's defined as an animal social system in which some individuals, which are referred to as alloparents, are assisting in rearing offspring that are not their offspring. So, individuals in a social group other than the mother and the father, biological mother and father, are helping to raise young. And you'll notice that in the title of my talk, I replace the word breeding with care. And that's just because, like, cooperative breeding is not really generally understandable if you're not a zoologist, whereas I think cooperative care more easily kind of gets at what this is talking about. And so a really famous example that's been really well studied of cooperative care in other species are members of wolf packs, where all the members of the pack provision the pregnant and nursing mothers, and then later they also directly provision the puppies with regurgitated foods. And this is especially true of wolf fathers. Mm. So, you've probably heard the old adage that it takes a village to raise a child, but that's not true of our most closely related species, other primates. And to take chimps as an example, chimp mothers hold their babies pretty much all day long. They provision them with little or no help from other members of their society. And if someone else is holding a baby chimp, then it's probably not going to end very well for the baby. Um, so the question then becomes, how did humans kind of become this outlier that engages in cooperative care of infants, an outlier among our most closely related species, primates, but also an outlier in terms of mammals and animals in general? So, Hurdy argues that human development and psychology have been shaped by a situation in which allo parents are contributing to the care of babies. Cooperative breeding is really actually quite rare among mammals. This is something that really surprised me when I started reading about this because I figured that it would be quite common just because I'm coming from a human perspective. But it's not. Only 3% of mammals do it. And among primates, the other primates that do cooperative care are small brained but very adorable primates, things like tamarins and marmosets. So what Hurdy has argued is that the evolution of cooperative breeding actually preceded the evolution of large brains. And more than that, she's argued that it was necessary in order for large brains to actually evolve in humans. So she kind of sums this up with this phrase that I really like, which is brains require care more than care requires brains. So she says, humans are born relatively helpless. They take a really long time to grow, and they have a particular organ in particular that makes them very energetically costly, which is their brain. And unlike other primates, even after they're weaned from breast milk, they continue to be provisioned by adults, including their parents, but then other members of society as well for many years. So they actually have an entire developmental phase called early childhood that other apes don't have at all. So this situation is one that Hurdy argues could never have evolved. This type of costly infant that takes a very long time to develop could never have evolved if it were not for the extra calories, basically, that are provided by alloparenting and cooperative care in human societies. So Hurdy explains the evolutionary drivers of cooperative breeding in her book, mainly from the perspective of the fitness of mothers. And the benefits I think are really obvious, especially if you have ever been a human mother. I'm raising my second baby right now, and it's even more obvious to me than it was when I only had one. So humans who benefit from cooperative care, mothers can spend more time finding food because other people are helping provision them or helping provision their babies. That allows them to reproduce again sooner. So over the course of their lifetime, they might have more surviving offspring. And this has been studied really extensively in the context of human societies that provision themselves with foraging, right, with hunting and gathering. So this is just one example from FA foragers in Central Africa. And you can see that, like, remarkably, I think, even at 3 weeks of age, some of these infants are being held by someone else that isn't their mother up to 60% of the time. And this is really remarkable because, like, they're spending basically half their day breastfeeding, right? So, Anytime they're not breastfeeding, they're basically being held by somebody else, is what this suggests. And this has also been studied in the industrialized world, right? Where there have been, actual studies of this, but just from our knowledge of how our own society works, we know that allo parents are really critical to the economic output and the reproductive success of female humans in our industrialized societies, right? So like we rely on other people taking care of our infants in order to be able to work to get money, right? To then afford to have more children and so on. And so throughout this section, I've got a lot of pictures of my first son's allo parents just to illustrate this example. This is my sister and my mom. And so, because they're close family members of mine, when they help me to raise a child, they're also increasing their own fitness because it increases the sort of chance, the likelihood of their genes being passed on to the next generation and the one after that, and so on and so forth. For babies, though, Hurdy argues that cooperative breeding is actually pretty fraught with danger, and that this is a critical thing that she uses to explain how our form of social intelligence has evolved. Because she argues that babies have to basically kind of thread a needle between being very highly gregarious and sort of seeking out allo parents and winning them over by being adorable and interacting with them and asking them for food and for care. But on the other hand, they also have to be able to judge who's likely to help them and who's likely to hurt them. And this varies a lot, like between human societies. So, this type of relationship, even between babies and their biological fathers, that many humans have with their dads, which is one in which their dads play a large role in caring for them, right? Like, this is my husband who is watching my baby right now, taking care of him. But even this relationship between a biological father and their child is pretty rare among mammals for biological fathers to play much of a role in raising their offspring. And even among human societies, it's not always true that fathers can be sort of trusted, right? It's something that babies have to judge. And so this combination of sort of weighing risks and benefits in terms of approaching different members of your social group is something that has really shaped human social intelligence, is what Hurdy argues. So then for our species overall, this has been studied by lots of anthropologists in lots of different social and economic contexts. We can see that the presence and sort of like quantity of allo mothers who are involved in the care of children increases child survival and well-being on multiple scores really cross-culturally. Interestingly, this really doesn't have anything to do with my talk. I just think it's cool. If we look cross-culturally, maternal grandmas are like the most likely to be the most helpful or the most beneficial to child survival and well-being. So I just put a picture of my mom and my son in here to give her a shout out. And nuclear families consisting of a mom and dad raising their children without help from extended family are really like a very recent aberration. They weren't the norm throughout human history, and even today, they're not the norm cross-culturally. So I read Hurdy's book while I was on maternity leave the first time, and it was recommended to me by my friend and the co-author of this paper, John Willman. So when my son was a newborn, both my mom and my husband went out of town for like a week. I can't remember how long it was. It seemed longer than it was. And I was finding it basically almost impossible to keep us both alive. So at some point during that time, I text John and because I knew that he studied human evolution and I had never really thought much about it before. And I was like, how did this evolve? Like, how was this successful enough to evolve? And he recommended that I read this book, Mothers and Others. And it really answered my question. And the answer is that moms are meant to have help, right? They have mostly had help, a lot of help raising infants in the past. And it really is pretty much impossible to do it alone, even in a society where you can do things like order dinner from DoorDash or something like that, right? It's still really difficult to do it alone. So for those of you that have never tried to raise a human infant, I put this up here. I'm like a scientist, so I was collecting data. This was data about my son's eating and sleeping when he was right around 3 months old. And this is the end of what some people have called the fourth trimester. So it's this like first 3 months of a human infant's life where they're really extremely needy in terms of how frequently they need to eat and how much contact they need to have with caregivers. But at this point, he was still eating 6 to 7 times a day, which obviously constrains the amount of time that I could spend sleeping, since I was exclusively breastfeeding him. If you were to look at what the schedule would look like in the first month of life, you would see that newborn human babies nurse 12 times a day on average. And exclusively breastfed babies also increase their mother's caloric needs by about 25%. So, in many human societies, the way that moms of newborns are able to sleep and eat, even while they're doing this, is because friends and relatives are actually allo nursing, meaning they're nursing their babies for them. This is something that's pretty rare in our, contemporary society in the United States, at least. We tend to supplement with formula or with pumped milk so that other people can give us a break so that we can rest. But this kind of like allo nursing is a really kind of like extreme form of allo parenting in which we actually share the load of provisioning infants. But provisioning of mothers is also really important because as you can see, there isn't a lot of time sort of left over here for finding food for yourself, right? And you have an increased caloric need. And so humans spend a lot of time actually providing food and sort of like relieving the burden of finding and preparing food for human mothers. Okay. So, while this book definitely answered a lot of my questions about what I was going through as like a first-time mom, as a scholar of domestication, I was like really excited when I read this book because it just I immediately saw this connection between cooperative care within human societies and cooperative care of other species young. And I felt really validated years later when I discovered that this really distinguished scholar of animal domestication, Juliet Clutton-Brock, had the exact same reaction to Herdy's thesis. So she, in her last book that she wrote in 2012, shortly before she passed away, she talks about reading Herdy's book, and she writes, "It's easy to see how hunter-gatherers could expand the shared care of their infants into the enfolding of young animals into their social groups." And I was like, yeah, exactly, except I would just add in plants and animals into their social groups. So that's basically what this paper is about, is how hunter-gatherers did this and what were the evolutionary effects then on the plants and animals that they kind of brought into their networks of cooperative care. So that brings me back to this paper. The way that we defined domestication in this paper is as an evolutionary process and a mutualistic relationship in which increased interspecies cooperative breeding results in changes to the genomes, bodies, and behaviors of one or both species. So as far as we know, no one had ever used the phrase interspecies cooperative breeding before, so we went ahead and defined it in the paper as occurring when one or both species are either directly provisioning mothers and young or creating niches for another species where reproduction can occur with less competition and predation. So for animals, direct provisioning is pretty easy to understand. We're like feeding animals, we're allowing them to eat our refuse, things like that. Plants don't eat food, so they're eating sun, right? Or they need manure, they need water. We're providing them with those things by doing things like weeding and irrigation and manuring. Um, Humans also greatly reduce pressure from competition and predation on reproducing mothers and young. So again, for animals, this is pretty easy to understand. We do things like letting them live in like a barn or a pen or in our house, protecting herds of animals with other domesticated animals, like using a dog to protect a herd of sheep, for example. For plants, we can see this most clearly, I think, with the practice of seed saving. Seed saving reduces the danger of pathogen attacks and also being consumed by an herbivore. And then humans, if they're skillful, they're also planting seeds in the most conducive place for them to grow, where they continue to guard them and to remove competitors through weeding and, hunting of prey animals and things like that. So, it's really easy to see how humans are doing this, how they're engaging in this interspecies cooperative care, but then we go on to talk about what are the evolutionary effects of these behaviors. And we talk about those in terms of three kind of broad sorts of types of change. So shifts in the development of juvenile plants and animals, loss or reduction in aggressive and defensive aspects of the phenotype. And then this third category is sort of one that we feel like it is largely determined by the species that's reproducing in these safe and abundant niches, what sorts of results occur. So I'll give a couple examples of that at the end. I always like to start with dogs, who are sort of like the first chronologically and in my heart in terms of domesticates, and provide a really good example of these developmental changes because they've been studied really well. Cool thing about dogs is that like wolves are not extinct, so we can actually study wolves and wolf behavior. Like we know that maybe not a perfect match for the population of wolves that was domesticated thousands of years ago, but they're pretty good. And so, one thing that we can see with dogs and wolves is that there's a shift in the critical period of socialization. And that's the stage in early development in which young animals form their primary social bonds. So, among mammals, most of their primary bonds are usually formed with their mother. in a process that's mediated by smell. Whereas in primates, the expansion of the neocortex has actually led to bonding that's mediated by multiple sensory cues, especially vision. So for dogs, dogs are have changed in ways that make them kind of more similar to primates, which is really interesting. The changes in the timing and critical period of socialization and its synchronization with sensory development and motor skills basically may have enabled stronger bonds to form with human caregivers. So to be specific, wolves begin to explore their environment when they're like 2 weeks old. And at this point, they can't see or hear. They're still living in a den with their mothers and their litter mates. So they form those primary social bonds using smell with their mom and with their litter mates. But by contrast, dogs actually start to explore and form bonds when they're 4 weeks old. At that point, they can already see, hear, and walk, which allows them to form those primary social bonds with other creatures, not just their mom and their litter mate within the den. And so, data from studies of feral dogs suggests that changes in dog development are only adaptive. In other words, they only increase the chance of survival if dogs are being cared for by humans. So this study by Boitani and colleagues summarized lots of studies of feral dog puppy mortality, and the results are pretty depressing and grim for these feral puppies. No studies report more than 37% surviving after the first 5 months. And the authors attribute this high mortality to the tendency of juveniles to basically begin to explore without adult supervision. So if humans are friendly, then puppies can form a primary social bond with a human using sight, hearing, and movement, and the human will care for them, and they have a pretty good chance of survival. And those bonds may also form with their litter mates or their mother, but they can also form with other species, right, with humans. But if humans are neutral or hostile, which is a situation that feral dogs face, then they're not very likely to survive because they're more inquisitive and friendly, and they're out like on their own at 4 weeks old looking for, humans to bond with. But they're not finding any, right? So they're more likely to, be run over by a car, eaten by a predator, or killed by a human or whatever. This is exacerbated by the fact that there's been another developmental change in between dogs and wolves, which is that dogs reproduce twice as often. So their mothers are already having potentially another litter of puppies much sooner and are not supervising their puppies for as long as a wolf would. Okay, so if we extend this thesis to plants, it may seem weird, but it's not really that controversial if we just look past differences in terminology. So many domesticated plants also have drastically altered their early development compared to their wild relatives, and these changes evolved as plants recruited humans to disperse their seeds. So the seeds of annual plants normally have a combination of germination inhibitors that are gradually eliminated during the dispersal process. So these are like protections on the seed. And they ensure the survival and dispersal of seeds. They ensure that the seeds don't sprout until they reach a favorable time and place for early growth. But domesticated annual plants have lost these protective inhibitors. Those parts of the seed just never develop, right? So their germination behavior, which is sprouting as soon as they're planted, is only adaptive if humans are gathering their seeds and keeping them safe until they're planted in a favorable place and at the right time of year. But if instead they're subjected to things that wild seeds experience all the time, things like abrasion, caustic chemicals, pathogen attacks, or months of dry or cold conditions without any protection, they're very unlikely to survive. So it's actually a perfect analogy to those puppies. They're friendly. Their survival depends on encountering humans to take care of them. Same for domesticated seeds. If people aren't collecting those seeds and saving them somewhere and planting them in a nice place, they're not going to be very likely to survive. Okay, so domesticated plants and animals also show a marked reduction in their aggressive and defensive aspects of their phenotypes compared to their wild relatives. And so for animals, this is super easy to understand, right? Like we can compare, for example, a cow and an oryx, and we can see that the cow is smaller, its horns are smaller, right? For animals where we can actually study behavior because the wild progenitor is still extant, we can see that this also is, they're less aggressive in terms of their behavior as well. For plants, to our knowledge, no one has ever really discussed plant phenotypes in terms of aggression, but plants are certainly capable of defending themselves. So for this, the primary example that we used in the paper is for perennial plants that are propagated clonally. So tuber crops, so things like potatoes and manioc, right? Things like this, where humans are eating a storage organ that plants use to cache energy, nutrients, and water during seasonally stressful periods. So the tubers of lots of wild plants, including progenitors of important crops, often contain defensive secondary compounds, which are poisons basically. And they discourage that those secondary compounds are there to discourage animals from eating the storage organ. And they've evolved lots of times because if animals eat this energy source of a plant, the plant can't survive, right? But when humans clonally reproduce these plants, they're providing a sort of like fitness compensation for the fact that they're also eating the plant's stored energy, right? Because they're propagating it. And perhaps even more importantly, by extending the range of these tuber crops and also by cultivating them, humans are relaxing the selective pressures that maintain the defensive phenotype in the wild, right? So it doesn't need as much protection against, for example, herbivores if humans are protecting it from getting eaten by herbivores. Or if they're expanding its range, they're taking it out of the range of its natural pathogens that would prey on it without those secondary compounds. So I think this provides a good sort of like way to seg into the last sort of catch-all category, which is like the evolutionary effects of reproducing in these kind of safe and predictable niches that humans create. And so for this is the image that I chose to represent this talk, right, is just a goofy image of me like feeding baby goats with my baby, right? But what humans do is sort of illustrated in this picture, right? We're creating a environment of safety, abundance, and predictability for our domesticated species in comparison to what they would experience in the wild. And this opens up all kinds of new opportunities for these species in terms of their the ways that they can behave and the sort of evolutionary pathways that are open to them. Um, so, for example, many of our important annual seed crops are descended from weedy plants. And here I'm using weedy in the ecological sense of adapted to frequent, unpredictable disturbance. Okay, so disturbed environments are heterogeneous across space and time, they're unpredictable. So, a lot of annual plants that live in these environments have evolved what are called bet-hedging strategies. And they're characterized by a lot of developmental plasticity. And both of those characteristics have been reduced by the more predictable environments that were created by human caretakers. So, this is something that I've been researching going back now like a decade, long before I came up with this idea. So, for example, one common bet hedging strategy that weedy annual plants have is they produce two different kinds of seeds that have different germination requirements. And that allows their progeny to disperse over time, to germinate in different years or different times of year in unpredictable environments, like, for example, a floodplain where you may have a flood occurring at different times of year or not occurring at all in certain years, right? Their domesticated relatives have lost this bet hedging strategy. Hmm. Instead, they're expressing only one phenotype, and that one is highly successful when humans are assisting in the dispersal of the plant and creating a favorable environment for the seedlings over a number of years. So basically, humans are reducing that unpredictability that they experience in the wild. So similar to weedy crop progenitors, behavioral studies of free-ranging domesticated cats are one of my favorite examples of this. And these studies suggest that abundant and predictable resources in early human villages kind of released this like latent behavioral plasticity in wild cats that allowed the domestication process to begin. So the social behavior of free-ranging domesticated cats continues to be quite plastic. And it ranges from solitary and territorial among cats who are subsisting by hunting, in sort of like unmodified, like a feral cat that's living like out in the woods and has to actually hunt, behaves a lot like a wild cat, like the wild progenitor. It lives by itself. It only interacts with other cats to breed, and it raises its offspring if it's a female without any help from any other cats. But on the other hand, provision cats, so for example, feral cats that are living on a farm, actually become very cooperative breeders themselves. They organize themselves into like extended families that are organized around female kin. Larger lineages often then will take control of food sources. And those lineages then have lower mortality than those of the peripheral groups, which suggests that cooperative cats have a kind of evolutionary advantage in this niche that's created by humans. And then they do things that are like really wild if you think about the sort of stereotype as cats as this really solitary creatures. Like for example, lineages of female cats alloparent to the same degree as humans. They even allonurse. So two, for example, sister cats will help nurse each other's offspring. So while one's off hunting, the other will nurse both litters. So this is really a remarkable degree of behavioral plasticity that cats have that's really dependent on what kind of environment they're living in. And when humans create this like really abundant niche, they're able to express this type of behavior that otherwise is impossible. So the other example that I have on here is chickens. Chickens can actually lay an order of magnitude more eggs per year than their wild relatives. So they're like vastly more reproductively successful, I guess you could say, have a vastly greater reproductive output than their wild progenitors. And this is actually true for all species where a comparison is possible. In other words, for species for which the wild progenitor still exists and we can study it, we can see that their reproductive cycles are less seasonally contingent, and that they are able to produce more offspring overall than their wild progenitors. And this would be impossible if humans were not provisioning them, right? Because the reason why their reproductive cycles are seasonal to begin with is because there are times of year when there simply are not enough resources to support offspring, right? So humans, by reducing that seasonal unpredictability, allow these animals to become more reproductively successful. So I know some of you in the audience are scholars of domestication yourselves, and maybe you are aware, if you're a scholar of domestication, that we already have probably 100 different definitions of domestication. It's actually kind of frustrating because we can't agree on what the definition is. So maybe you're greeting this kind of like proposal of a new definition with like a little bit of weariness or maybe even annoyance. But we believe that conceiving of domestication as interspecies cooperative breeding is simple, it's widely applicable, and it's intellectually useful because it can resolve ongoing debates and suggest new avenues of research. So first, we suggest that whereas self-domestication and cooperative breeding have been seen as kind of distinct arguments, in other words, the people who are studying these things are not really talking to each other, they actually, it's increasingly clear that they're actually describing the exact same process and phenomenon, at least with respect to human evolution. Second, this definition includes instances of domestication that don't include humans, as long as they're involving one species protecting or provisioning the mothers and young of another species. So this has always been a big debate, is like, should we include like ants farming fungus and things like that in terms of domestication? That absolutely works with our definition. We're fine with that. And there could actually be a lot more domesticatory relationships in nature than the ones that we've so far heard of. But we think that, if you're interested in finding more, you should look first towards species that engage in cooperative breeding within their own species, and also that tend to be like particularly good at ecosystem engineering or niche construction because they're able to create those kind of like abundant and predictable niches for other species. And third, we think that it's really interesting and important that this definition, unlike other definitions, explains why humans are involved in so many domesticatory relationships. It gets at this why question of domestication that's incredibly difficult to understand. So, finally, I think I want to just wrap up by saying that, the root of the word domestication comes from Latin. It's domesticus, belonging to the household. Domesticated species are literally family. Humans enfold them into our societies of cooperative care, even if we also then eat them. And humans are especially good at forming these interspecies cooperative breeding relationships because cooperative breeding is a critically important strategy for human societies, and it's shaped the evolution of our particular kind of social intelligence. And that's all I got. I'm happy to chat and answer questions for the next 15 minutes.
Thanks very much, Dr. Mueller. Folks, we can take questions in the chat, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself and turn on your video if you'd like to ask a question. Especially those of you who are designing research projects right now, I highly encourage you all to check out these papers. A lot of them are open access or available with the click of an email. If you've never built in a deer protocol to your experimental design, then we've got some great papers for you to read up on that from Dr. Mueller.
Are we okay to just ask a
Please go
question?
ahead. Yes.
Hi. That was fantastic. That was so great. Really applicable to some research that I'm doing with the Historical Ecological Research Lab. And I was just wondering about the plants that you're talking about. Are they all annual plants? And I was just wondering what it changes at all with some of your definitions or like some of the research that you're doing with these annual species might apply to sorry, I have a cold. Might apply to perennial species like shrubs and etc. Like yeah.
Yeah, great question. So, yes, in the paper that we wrote, we did use the only perennial plants that we explicitly discussed are the ones that I talked about briefly in this presentation. So things like tuber crops, right? And I don't know whether we reference some of the ones that are like not always considered domesticated, like camas, but they definitely would fit into the some of the same things that I was saying about those particular crops. I haven't really like I started to think about how this could be applied to tree crops like berries and fruits and nuts and things like that, but I haven't really gotten very far. Basically, I just like ran out of time. I was like I got, I gotta finish this paper, right? But I definitely would like to think through how that could be applied. So the one study that does come to mind, but I didn't include it in the paper because it's just too hard to explain, is this study of persimmons that was done several years ago. And I can send it to you if I'm blanking on the name of the author right now. But basically, what she found was that you know how plants that have separate male and female plants, they can actually sometimes switch sex in response to their growth environment, which is it's a really interesting capability that these plants have. Yeah. And so persimmons will actually like manifest there'll be more female persimmon plants in abundant environments, like ones where they have like rich soils, lots of water and things like that. And so what this paper showed was that there seemed to be like a correlation between these populations of persimmon trees that had a lot of females and sites and archaeological sites, which suggested that humans might be might be aware of this, right? And planting them in places where they had a lot of resources so that they would get more fruits. So that I don't know how to like spin that out into domestication because it takes so long to domesticate trees and shrubs that usually like it's kind of hard to prove that they were domesticated, but it's definitely like an avenue to explore, I think.
Yeah, sorry, I not another question, but just to add on to that is one of the crops that I'll be participating in research is beaked hazelnuts.
Oh, cool.
In the Kittilas Canyon with Dr. Chelsea Armstrong, and
Hmm.
it's a very clear like an ancient transplanting at least, whether or not that falls under current definitions of domestication, but it does fall under this definition of domestication because of transplanting. And
Hmm.
yeah, that's interesting to explore like the sex switch and then the changes also in like functional traits.
Hmm.
Okay, I'll let other people answer. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think like absolutely, definitely what people are doing to care for shrubs and trees and things like that falls under this domestication. It's just, or this definition of domestication. The interesting thing will be trying to predict what traces you might see in their phenotypes or their genomes of that care, right? If any. Yeah. Okay, I saw Annabelle's
Hi.
hand up.
I'm glad she brought up Chelsea Armstrong because I think you can see domestication moving way out and perennials when you look at the landscape because I mean think of Australia before or at the time of contact and think of the work that Armstrong has done up in BC looking at how they completely changed um, the plant communities over many a hundred years, and it's hard to look at a situation where there is a control in the Maya forest. But I mean, when you see that the dominant trees are all useful, it's hard to imagine that didn't involve some human intervention. I don't know. I think there's a big continuum in that concept of domestication.
Yeah,
I call it
absolutely.
cropscape.
I like that. Or like a foodscape, right?
Yeah. hmm
Yeah, I mean
Well, it's
another
habitat too. I guess food for animals and plants. So that's a
right.
good way to look at it.
Another like way of talking about domestication that I find to be very compelling and interesting and is related to this, but not the same, is the idea of landscape domestication, which is just this like idea, like let's get away from maybe having to document some specific phenotypic or genotypic change in a species and instead think about like how does the landscape change in terms of the distribution and abundance of species that are important to people. And so, that's yet another definition of domestication, but one that I really like and try to use in my research too. Yeah, I have been really focused on annual plants thus far, but I'm trying to get away from that and think more about the whole landscape and all of the plants and animals
Yeah,
on it.
well, if you don't start with the annuals, that's the beginning of the cycle. Um,
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
and
true.
those, I mean, those have to be around. I mean, in the case of planting, and I mean, Maya milpa has what we might call weeds, but it turns out if you look at them, they're all useful too in different kinds of ways.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you. I'm trying to see if there's questions in the chat. No, just comments. Anything else from the audience?
Can I ask another question?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. When you're talking about sort of this definition of interspecies domestication, and then you were mentioning too like ants and fungus.
Mhm.
And I know you're specifically talking about this in relationship with like humans, but I was just wondering, have you encountered anything in the sense of like I suppose this relationship between like people in a species and maybe like a tertiary species sort of getting involved like within it. Like for example, like if you started domesticating a species and then suddenly a wild fungus comes in and is like, oh great, like look at this rich environment, etc. I'm just wondering, yeah, I guess just like in that way, altering on a landscape scale. Um, what are your, yeah, if you encountered anything like on that, like these like sort of like tertiary players who like sort of like kind of come in the way that like, you maybe like start raising a bunch of kids and then like you have a lot of extra scraps and you're like feeding the cats outside and like, I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's sort of like the accidental effects of what humans are doing, and then sometimes humans like have obviously picked up on that and turned it into like a whole new domesticatory relationship. So like a couple of examples, like there's tons of things that I could talk about, but since you mentioned fungus, like a example of the sort of like unintentional one is like the relationship that is described in the ethnography Mushroom at the End of the World, where you have like an industrial tree farm that then is like really good at producing this, that's producing something for humans. It's like a vastly oversimplified ecosystem that's producing timber. But then it's also really good at producing this like specific mushroom that humans really like, and they're going out and harvesting it, right? Like kind of incidentally. And the other one that is like on more of a deep time scale, so we can see how it actually has ended up playing out, is the relationship between grazing animals and certain animal species. It's another thing that I've written a lot about. So, like in the Andes, for example, there's a pretty well documented relationship between people domesticating llamas and alpacas and then later domesticating quinoa and amaranth. And the idea is that, by domesticating these animals first, they brought them into close proximity to their homes. The animals eat a lot of quinoa and amaranth. The quinoa and amaranth are growing in their corrals right next to where people are living, right? And then over time, people are like, oh, wow, this is really great food too. And they start interacting with those plants. And then the plants sort of like take off on a different trajectory. And they go from being just like incidental weeds that are growing around people's houses to being important crops, right? And that's happened in different places all over the world, but that's sort of like the best documented case in the Andes. Yeah. So, I think with contemporary examples, we don't really know like kind of where they'll go. But when you look back at, ancient humans, the ecosystems that they've modified have led to like changes in the plants and animals that they seem to be targeting at the time, but then these kind of like knock-on effects that where they noticed some other plant or animal in that ecosystem and started to interact with that as well. Well, it's right, it's like 2:59 right now, so um, I guess if nobody else has a burning question, then hopefully I'll get to see y'all soon. Like I'm bummed out that I'm not going to be at the conference this year because it's my favorite conference, but hopefully I'll see y'all next year in Boston.
Hopefully, we'll see everybody If not this year, May 20th through the 23rd at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. Registration's still open. We can all meet up in the following year in Boston. For more on human and environmental relationships across deep time, please be sure to check out our society journals. Alongside these larger meetups that we have, the Journal of Ethnobiology, Ethnobiology Letters and Contributions in Ethnobiology, and check out Dr. Mueller's amazing papers and research across experimental growing, sleeping crops, bison and fires, and the roles of domestication, and of course, interspecies cooperative breeding and care as a fundamental ecological feature of life on Earth. Thanks so much for joining us, all of you, and especially Dr. Mueller. Friends, see you next time.
Bye. Thank you.